Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel Pipes, who is the president of the Middle East Forum and is out with a new book, Israel Victory, How Zionists Will Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberated. So, could you show the book for our viewers once?
I can.
So, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And I was reading the book and I realized how much of it is not just important in the present context, but as I was reading the book, I read the first page and you mentioned that it was written even before the October 7 attacks happened. I wanted to understand that first, in the first chapter, you actually mentioned that the current peace process has failed to achieve lasting peace. And this was written even before the October 7 attacks. Could you elaborate on the specific reasons you believe the strategies that have been employed in the last decade or so has failed to get any sort of peace and have been ineffective? And what is your proposed way of seeking an Israeli victory?
I think there are many reasons why the diplomacy has failed, but perhaps the most important has been a general international willingness to ignore, to become blind to the fact that the Palestinian Authority, the institution created by diplomacy, seeks to destroy Israel. There is a general acceptance of the idea that it's willing to work with Israel and exist next to Israel. Yet the evidence is overwhelming that the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, wishes to eliminate and destroy Israel, the Jewish state. So that willful blindness has meant that diplomacy simply can't work. You can't have a successful diplomatic process between one side that simply wants to exist and the other side that wants to destroy it. That means war. It doesn't mean diplomacy. So diplomacy has been premised on a false assumption that the PA accepts Israel when it does not.
And this is one of the things which came at the forefront when the war started. And one of the things I wanted to understand, and you've mentioned this in the book as well, about organization, let's say, like the UNRWA, which have actually started putting out what the Palestinians want. And the Palestinian version of rejectionism from the very beginning in school textbooks. How does that Palestinian rejectionism hinder any sort of peace process between Israel and Palestine in the long run?
What I mean by Palestinian rejectionism is saying to Israelis, Jews more broadly, no, 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 we hate you, we want to kill you, we reject you. And this has its origins as far back as the 1880s. And it's understandable in the 1880s when the people we now call Palestinians were far more numerous and powerful than the Zionists. But today, at a time when it's Israel that has the wings of F-35 aircraft and the high-rise buildings, and the Palestinians have nothing comparable in economic or military terms, it's a bit strange. It's not just morally repugnant, but it is practically counterproductive. It's not working. How can the Palestinians say to the Israelis, we hate you, we want to kill you, get out of here, when the Israelis are so much stronger? Yet still they persist, on and on, decade after decade. That's what I call Palestinian rejectionism, the ideology of rejectionism.
Now I want to come across one of the key elements in your book, which is the idea of victory. So you define victory as the key to resolving the conflict and emphasizing that one side must decisively prevail. So what criteria do you use to measure victory in a context as complex as the Israel-Palestinian conflict? And how do you address concerns that this approach might lead to further entrenchment and resistance from the Palestinian groups as well?
Well, I'm a historian, so I look at the past to see the way humans have behaved. And I see that in most cases, not every case, but most cases, international wars have ended when one side gives up. And the more thoroughly it gives up, the more thoroughly the resolution will last. If it's temporary, it won't last long. If it's complete, it will last a long time. So, for example, in World War I, the Germans and their allies gave up, but temporarily and partially. And so just 20 years later, they sought to try and win again. In World War II, the Germans and their allies realized that they really had lost, and they accepted that loss and moved on. I think you see that pattern in many wars. If it's partial, if it's incomplete, then the war will resume. So, for example, today, South Korea and North Korea have not fought for 70 years, and yet neither side has given up, and the war could resume as we speak at this moment. So, clear defeat, acceptance that one's war goals cannot be achieved, is the way in which most wars end. Now, that could happen that either Israelis give up their war goal, which is the acceptance of Israel, or the Palestinians give up their war goal, which is the destruction of Israel. I would say, from a moral, ethical point of view, one has to be with the Israelis, that they be accepted. They have a flourishing country, can't be destroyed. So the Palestinians need to be convinced that their war goal of destroying Israel is unachievable. So that's what I mean by Israel victory.
I wanted to understand that, do you feel a victory could be achieved in a certain way that acknowledges and addresses the Palestinians' aspiration? Because one of the largest or the most quoted reason by the Palestinians authority has been an aspiration for a statehood. Does the Israeli victory can some way or the other address the Palestinian grievances as well?
For sure, yes. The Israeli goal is acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state. The Israeli goal is not to prevent the Palestinians from flourishing, from having a state or anything else. The Israelis have become skeptical of the Palestinians getting power and being able to find new methods to attack Israel. But if the Palestinians would just leave Israel alone, the Israelis would be perfectly happy to leave the Palestinians alone. So when it comes to Palestinian state, I say it's out of the question in the short term, so long as the Palestinians remain rejectionist and remain intent on destroying Israel. But when the day comes that the Palestinians in large majority, not every single one, but when the Palestinians in large majority accept that Israel's there, it is the Jewish state, they need to leave it alone and go their own way, at that point, Palestinian state is fine. But that's going to take some time.
And one of the other risks that you mentioned in the book as well about was the nuclear threat of Iran. And you compare this threat with the Palestinian threat as well. And one you mentioned was the existential threat. The other, the Palestinian, is more of a narrative threat. So could you expand that a little bit for audience to what you exactly mean by that?
Well, I think both existential threats to Israel. One is obviously having nuclear weapons is an existential danger. But I would also say that Israel uniquely is threatened by hostility from the outside world, not necessarily military hostility. But imagine that, say, Jeremy Corbyn became the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Bernard Sanders became the President of the United States, and Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, became the President of France, and so forth. Israel would be isolated, Israel would be weakened, and Israel would face an existential threat. So the hostility towards Israel that is based on the Palestinian narrative is indeed, I would say, an existential threat to Israel. The Israelis don't tend to see this. The Israelis tend to focus on violence. I would argue that in the case of Iran, it's violence, not the story they're telling. In the case of the Palestinian, it's the story they're telling, not violence, that poses the great threat to Israel.
And once this kind of stories that the Palestinian state have been putting out on the international platforms, we see much more of the sympathy or a sense of victimhood that drives their foreign policy when we see a lot of aid coming in and international support. How does that impact the idea of an Israeli victory?
The fact that the Palestinians have a huge, unprecedented network of support around the world, particularly from Muslims and from the left, is very important. If they were an obscure national liberation movement that nobody had heard of, Israel's task would be much easier. The fact that it gets money, political support, and more is of great importance and makes Israel's task that much more difficult. Yes, it's very important. But I would argue that Israel has made a mistake in trying to address the Muslims around the world, the leftists around the world, the dictators around the world, who are too big. Israel's a pretty small country, 10 million people. Instead, the Israelis should focus on the Palestinians, who are smaller yet and weaker, and I believe after all these decades are beginning to see the futility of continuing down the path of rejectionism. My advice to the Israelis is take a chance, try to spend money and effort to work on the Palestinians, to convince them that rejectionism is the wrong approach, that they should work with Israel. I think Israel will find a fair amount of positive response.
And I want to understand a couple of things here. One is, of course, the role of the military power that we have seen, even in this war as well, has been important in achieving a certain sense of victory. So do you feel a more assertive use of force is important for victory? And how do this put in the larger context, in the long term of achieving a sense of a moral victory as well by the use of force?
Well, of course, force is the basis of any conflict. And I did mention that Israel has wings of F-35s. That's very important. But in the long run, I would argue that rejectionism is an idea. And a bad idea can only be replaced with a good idea, not with force. Force is necessary. But beyond force, there needs to be another idea, the acceptance, the normalization with Israel. So my slogan in the book is minimal violence, maximal messaging. Israel, of course, must use force, but the solution does not lie in force. It lies in convincing the Palestinians that they've lost and that they should turn around and work with Israel rather than fight Israel. I think there's a possibility. Can't promise it, no guarantee, but I think there's a good chance, and it hasn't been tried. The Israelis have not tried that before. Striking to note, they have not tried it. Time for them, I would say, to try it.
And in this regard, do you also see, which is also an evident part in your book, that there should be a very fundamental shift in the Palestinian leadership as well and how Israel engages with them in the long term? What specific changes do you recommend in this approach when Israel deal with the Palestinian leadership to alter at least the narrative?
Well, I'm recommending two major steps to the government of Israel. The first I have covered, being convinced the Palestinians they've lost and that they should work with you, Israel. And the second is the immediate and total destruction of both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, which are evil, aggressive, brutal institutions. They were permitted and indeed funded, and in the case of the PA, is still funded by Israel. I think that's a huge mistake. These need to be replaced with what I call decent institutions. These will not be happy, friendly, democratic, liberal places to live. They will be police states, but they'll be police states that move the population in the right direction. I compare what I would like to see in Gaza, what I'd like to see the Israelis rebuild in Gaza, is a police state along the lines of what one sees in Egypt or Jordan, the nearby Arab Muslim states. Tough police states, where if you stay away from politics, stay away from radical ideologies, you can live a perfectly fine life. But if you do, you will find yourself in a lot of trouble. So I think that's necessary in the short term. Long term, I hope there'll be a full democracy and so forth. But the short term, democracy is not suitable.
And this is one thing I want to ask you next, that we have seen in this particular war as well, the most of the Western countries, especially America, has pushed Israel to negotiate and go for a path of diplomacy rather than using of hard military force. But in your book, while I was reading it, you have critiqued traditional diplomatic efforts, and especially you have shown how the Oslo Accord failed, and that created more problems for Israel. How could these initiatives of diplomacy, since it's flawed, be particularly approached? And do you see any diplomatic initiatives helping to get a sense of victory for the Israeli state?
The striking thing is that the Biden administration is the first American administration in decades not to have a peace plan for Israel and the Palestinians, which is a good thing. On the other hand, since October 7th, the president has had two conflicting goals. One is to be sympathetic and helpful to Israel as it was attacked and over 1,000 people murdered and over 200 taken hostage. He's clearly been sympathetic to Israel, wanted to help it. On the other hand, he has an election coming up in 4 months, and he has an significant element in the Democratic Party on the left that despises Israel, hates Israel, wants to see Israel disappear. So he's trying to do two things at once. And this, of course, leads to an inconsistent, incoherent, even oxymoronic foreign policy. And it's a reflection of the kind of mistakes that the US government and other governments keep making when they try to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict through diplomacy. They don't quite understand its nature, which starts with Palestinian rejectionism. Have to accept that that's the dynamic and have to deal with it. And if you've got other considerations like being reelected, you're not going to deal with it effectively.
And since the war right now is going, I want to understand as well, how does your thesis of achieving an Israeli victory would apply in the current situation, and what step would you probably ask Israel government to take against Hamas to achieve a decisive victory?
Well, the good news from my point of view is that victory has become a constant term since October 7th. In particular, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has, by my count, talked about it or written about it on 62 different occasions. Probably more than, I don't see everything he does and says. all the time, and many others. The less good part is that in contrast to prior Israeli wars with their enemies, this one is going on and on. It's 8 months. With the exception of the very first war, 1948-49, which also went on for many months, the wars have been short. The longest, I think, was 52 days. This one is now close to 300. So the Israelis have not shown very great competence. Or put it differently, Hamas has shown particular abilities. So Israel victory is more difficult. You know, the Israelis defeated 3 Arab state armies in 6 days. That was extraordinary. Now they can't defeat not even a state, a weak, small institution in close to 300 days. So on the one hand, the good news is that they've taken in this notion of victory, this goal of victory. On the other hand, it's proving much more difficult than it was in the past.
And the last thing that I want to ask you on the follow-up is, if I know I don't want to give much in the book, and I want people to go and read the book, but I still would want you, for people who are watching it, at least if you could outline a few immediate and long-term steps that you would want the Israeli state to take to achieve a certain sense of victory that you mentioned in the book.
Well, we have gone over them. The first was to direct money and attention to convincing the Palestinians they've lost and that they should work with Israel. And the second is eliminating the Hamas and PA institutions. Those are my 2 main steps. And I would argue that these are what I call solution agnostic. Whatever you think Israel should be doing in the long term, whatever you think, taking these steps, convincing the Palestinians they've lost, is a benefit to Israel. But I would also argue, and this is a bit ironic, that the Israelis are basically a happy people, successful economically, culturally. The Palestinians are not. They're oppressed, they're poor, they are frustrated. So defeat of the Palestinians had obvious benefits for Israel. But I would argue it has even greater benefits for the Palestinians themselves. Once freed from this obsessive urge to destroy their neighbor, the Palestinians can achieve great things. They can build a polity, economy, culture, and society that is worthy of their ambitions and can be a positive force in the world. So everybody gains. It's not like Israel gains, Palestinians lose. No, Israel gains and Palestinians gain yet more. That's the deep irony here.
Well, that's all the question that I had. So thank you so much, Daniel, for taking your time and speaking to us.
My pleasure.